Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. And in this episode of the podcast, I had the pleasure of interviewing Tom Parker, head of China for the Australian Football League, which means we are talking about something I'm very passionate about, and that's sports. More specifically, we are discussing the ins and outs of trying to take one of the most indigenous sports on the planet and introduce it to the largest population on the planet. We discussed some of the backstory on why the AFL decided to go to China in the first place, how the AFL has been received so far in China, the eccentricities of the Chinese sports fan, and the challenges presented to Tom trying to grow the sport there. We talk about how to market a sport like the AFL in China and what the fanship of a Chinese sports fan looks like when they are following their team. We also talk about Australia's relationship with China over the years and why Tom is optimistic that the worst of it is behind them. Enjoy.
You know, I think they're kind of coming out with 84 in the Olympics without the Russians there at the LA Games, you know, Li Ning winning and where that went from there. And then on top of that, I think you had volleyball, obviously has been huge for ages, you know, gymnastics, and then diving as well, where they've been really, really super good, and then table tennis. And I think what you saw from kind of organised or professional sports, a lot of those were Olympic or sports, which, you know, interestingly are actually very individual in their kind of orientation.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies.
Tom, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So let's talk a little bit about your history in China, you know, some about how you ended up in China, where your interest in China began, some of your professional successes in the market there.
Sure. Well, I guess in some ways it kind of is quite fitting that it was family that kind of introduced me to China. So I'm the youngest of 7, which is quite unusual in Australia. And my older sister, one of my older sisters, married a Bruneian Chinese guy who studied high school here in Australia, and then they met at university. And they, his father was quite ill at the time, and he used to come to Melbourne for dialysis. And so we kind of, through the marriage, got kind of introduced to an overseas Chinese community. And this is in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And I was like a young kid. I was like, 7 or 8. And it was just kind of captivating in a way that Australia was a fairly monoculture at that time. And to kind of be invited out to yum cha, to be eating chicken's feet, to be going to Baptist weddings in sort of deep suburban Melbourne, you know, where the groom had a bigger perm than the bride. And, you know, it was crazy times. And I think it was just that sort of sense of difference of whether it was, you know, I don't know, the food, the dragons, the firecrackers. It was all that sort of aspect that we kind of got caught up in through my sister's marriage and I guess introduction. They moved back to Southeast Asia, but we kind of got adopted in. And interestingly enough, it was my mum who in the mid-'80s took a night class to learn Mandarin. And she wanted to do it because her son-in-law, grandmother, her Paw was from Fujian, and she didn't speak any English. She was a tiny, tiny little woman. And my mum really wanted to talk to her. And my mum had always had an interest in kind of decorative arts and the culture and those things of China. And so I guess seeing my mum do it, and then I was really kind of lucky enough to go to a high school, only really one of a handful that actually taught Mandarin in the 80s. And so I had context for that language learning, and Australians are pretty bad language learners. You know, French and German are your usual sort of, you know, subjects. And then more recently in the 70s, it was Indonesian, and then Japanese, obviously through the 80s. But yeah, doing Mandarin in the 80s was kind of pretty weird. And it was just a subject I really liked. And so from there, I sort of did it at university. And then probably for me, I went to China at the end of my first year of university, which would have been early 90s, 92, I think, end of 92, 93, that sort of winter in Beijing, and studied at the Second Foreign Languages Institute with a whole bunch of kind of Australians that were over there doing, a winter study break, our summer. And yeah, it was amazing. For me, it's sort of all the stories and all the dialogues that you learn in textbooks kind of came to life. And I remember the moment. It was like sitting in the soft-sleater waiting room of the Beijing railway station, and I'm sure, Todd, you've been there many times. And back then they had these heavy kind of armchairs with like antimacassar kind of slips over the back, and like a glass cabinet selling instant noodles and stuff like that. And I remember seeing a sign for M&Ms, and it said in Chinese, and I could read it, melts in your mouth, not in your hand. And it was that moment where I thought, wow, I was really fascinated with that sort of intersection of kind of, I guess, Western consumer culture and advertising and how it was being brought into China. I mean, I'm reflecting back. I mean, at that stage, I probably just wanted to buy some candy. But, yeah, for me, that was kind of the moment. So hard shell confectionery changed my life. And then from then on, I kind of went through university, did my honours, went and studied at ANU, which is a pretty well-known sinology department, studied under a guy called Jeremy Barmay, who's sort of one of Australia's leading sinologists, and really thought I was going to end up like an academic. So I was really into music. I went to China. I studied in Shanghai at Huaxida, East China Normal University, for a year after my undergraduate degree before I did my postgrad. I played in a band. We were called Hogwall or Hot Pot. I was nicknamed Lamb, obviously, because I was white. And we played in all the, and all the kind of, it was 95, I think. And so, bars were starting to open up. They weren't just expat bars anymore. They were kind of having music, and it was like Spinal Tap. It was awesome. We had musicians who were proper musicians from the Shanghai Conservatory of Music that were cellists and, Chinese percussionists. And here I was, like a long-haired white guy from Melbourne who knew a few alternate tunings. And that was good enough. I actually played with a couple of African bands too, which was cool. But so I had a real interest in music. So I did my postgrad on Deng Lijun, or Teresa Teng. And she was a Taiwanese kind of songstress who kind of took China by storm in the 80s and was labeled a spiritual pollutant and all this sort of stuff. So I kind of was into that space. And then our government shifted from being a very pro-China and very much into Asian languages and kind of embracing, I guess, our near northern neighbours, to kind of being a lot more conservative and probably more traditional. Very business focused. And so I kind of stepped out of academia and then worked in kind of public programs. I worked for an organization called AsiaLink, which is very much like and founded on the same sort of principles of the Asia Society in New York. Similarly, instead of the Rockefeller Foundation, it was the Maya Foundation, which is a very famous Melbourne business family. Did their public programs for a couple of years and really, really enjoyed it. Lucky enough to get a scholarship from the Australian government in the early 2000s. In 2000 it was actually. And I was in my late 20s. I kind of studied in China for a while. I was still kind of dabbling and still using my Chinese, but I hadn't really worked in China. And so I really wanted to get over there to work in China. And I think I wrote to the Beijing Olympic Bid Committee and said, I could do your PR or something. And I didn't get the gig, but I ended up getting a scholarship. And so through that, we got to study again at the University of International Business in Beijing, and studied in Chinese, and doing like, Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations in Chinese was pretty amazing. But as a scholarship student, I think they just kind of passed us anyway, even though, my Chinese was nowhere near as good as my Korean classmates. And then from there, I kind of did a whole bunch of internships. I worked with Brian Wallace at Redgate Gallery for a bit. because I knew him through sort of some programs we'd done at AsiaLink, and then worked for the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, in their Beijing bureau. So I was kind of a stringer. I was a researcher, a part-time translator, and really loved it. And from there, that was really kind of where I thought I was going to end up in terms of media and journalism. And I'd been sort of doing that for a while in different guises, mainly through magazines and print. And it was a great opportunity. I actually met my wife, who was also from Melbourne. So it's weird that you kind of travel halfway around the world and end up with someone from your own town. And so we had a whirlwind romance in Beijing. But both of us kind of feeling in our late 20s, we wanted to change our careers, and realized that, and had sort of seen that there's that kind of foreign expat princeling mentality where you get offered these crazy roles or opportunities, whether it's a modeling contract or you go and work for your national broadcaster, just because of proximity and opportunity, you get these. And particularly in those days, I think there were fewer foreigners that spoke Chinese.
I was on the radio for a while.
Yeah. And I got a magazine. I'm not photogenic, and I think when I was at uni in 95, I was in some, fashion spread for shirts in some kind of Shanghai fashion magazine, and I got recognized, in a urinal, which wasn't a good thing. So anyway,
hey, aren't you that guy?
Anyway, and so we moved back to Australia. I kind of stuck at it with ABC for a bit, but kind of realized I wasn't a broadcast journo. From there, I went into politics. Well, I worked for our city of Melbourne, which is our local government, or the sort of city government, as a media advisor, and then transitioned into a trade role. And then really from there, found my straps and really loved taking businesses to China. And then in 2007, just before the GFC, I went out on my own and set up my own business, which was really a China advisory business called Red Tape Consulting. And so really I left China living there in sort of just before SARS. But have been back pretty much, every year, anywhere between sort of 4 to 12 times a year, depending on clients and things, and still keeping up my contacts. So, working, and then that China advisory business was acquired by another business called Bastion. And then sort of about 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, took up a new role at the AFL. But I think for me, probably couple of my big highlights was in 2010 as part of the World Expo. I worked for one of the businesses that managed the Australian pavilion and the US pavilion and the Brazilian, and I think the New Zealand coffee shop, which was weird. But anyway, it was an Australian run sort of business that ran these things. And so I did a lot of recruitment for staff in the Australian pavilion, bilingual staff. But one of the things that I wanted to do was to kind of showcase Australian kind of culture and sport. So I'd been working on this project for a couple of years, but we got to do it at the 2010 World Expo. We got the Australian government to kind of support the AFL presenting an exhibition match. And I know the AFL's played in Toronto, that played in, I think, Vancouver. They used to have a series in Miami and America, Japan. They've, pretty much been all over the world, but they'd never really played an official exhibition game in China. So the Melbourne Football Club and the Brisbane Lions played as part of the World Expo, I think on the second last weekend, about October the 18th or something, out at Jiangwan Stadium, which is this amazing Art Deco kind of Neolithic concrete masterpiece built in the 1930s for the national games. And it's one of the few kind of stadiums in the world, in China anyway, that can hold the dimensions that we require for our playing pitch, playing field. So getting that off the ground, and seeing that sort of succeed. And I'm a Melbourne supporter, and to kind of see Melbourne come from behind and win in the last quarter in Shanghai was a great feeling. So that's kind of one of my great achievements, I think.
Talk to us a little bit about the AFL. What is the AFL, and what are you doing in your day-to-day as head of China?
Sure. So The AFL is the Australian Football League. It's, I guess, Australia's dominant local sporting code, and our only sort of truly indigenous one. So it's comparable to the NFL or the NBA in terms of its reach, or the NHL in terms of TV audiences. I think we're the third most attended, on average, sort of games in the world, behind sort of NFL, Bundesliga, and the EPL. So, we have about 7 million fans come to the games. Great TV audiences of over 120 million, which, for North American audiences, that's not very big, but in a country of 25 million, that's huge. So we have over 1 million Australians are paid up members of an AFL club. So which means sort of 1 in 25 Australian gives money to an AFL club. So we're dominant. Our AFL Grand Final, which is on in 4 weeks' time, is the most watched TV show or TV broadcast in Australia. So and it grew out of being a kind of a winter sport to keep cricketers fit in Victoria. And so a history of about 160 odd years, founded in 1858. It's a unique game that kind of brings in people have called it aerial ping pong, has no offside. It's 18 players. It's a great spectacle. And certainly I think for those 150 odd years, with the exception of kind of exhibition games, which were probably more end of season trips for the players and officials and getting them to go to great locations, and, having a good time, there was no real effort really to expand out, and look beyond our own backyard. I think for us, the reason for China is that, China is Australia's number one trading partner. We have a significant Chinese population here in Australia. 5% of our population is Chinese or has Chinese heritage. Similar to California and other parts of the world. There's a diaspora that traces back to the gold rush, the 1860s. And I think through that as well is that we're mindful that globally in sports sponsorship, if you think back to the 70s and 80s, it was the Japanese car makers that started to really advertise and look for brand building through sports. Then in the 90s and early 2000s, it was your Samsungs, your LGs, your Kias, the Korean brands. And, as China was going global, we saw sport really is a great way to localize and normalize your brand in a market. And Australia's a really interesting market, I think, for a lot of Chinese brands. We're highly competitive. We're really overregulated. But if you can make money and find a way to do things in Australia, it's a great testing ground. And partly because if you stuff up, no one's really going to know. But, it's a great kind of testing ground, I think. And so, if you think back to LG was Lucky Gold Star. It rebranded, and its first sports sponsorship was in Melbourne, actually with the Melbourne Football Club in the 90s, and that turned around to being sort of a massive sports sponsorship. Similar with Emirates. Emirates is one of the dominant kind of global sporting partners of Arsenal and owns stadiums across the world. But it started with Collingwood, which was an AFL club in 2000 and in 2000. So, yeah, there's that opportunity. But I think the other reason is necessity, in the sense that, particularly in Victoria, we've got 10 out of the 18 AFL clubs are based here. We have the Grand Prix. We have the Australian Open, which is in the start of the year. We have the Melbourne Cup. We have 2 national basketball teams. We've got 2 soccer teams, 3 soccer teams now. And not to mention, that's just in men's sport. And with the sort of proliferation of women's sport, that's sort of just seeing that for a country as obsessed by sport, it means that there are fewer global players or even local players that are able to kind of pay for, I guess the starting price to engage commercially with a sporting code like the AFL. And given that we played the exhibition game in China in 2010, we saw we could do it. And so it was actually really an Adelaide club called Port Adelaide, and they just they got a Chinese sponsor, and sort of unknown to us, and are probably even a bit unknown to them. In the contract, they put in best endeavours to play a game in China. Now, best endeavours is not a binding term in a contract. It kind of, means that, yeah, we'll look at it, but we probably won't do it. And anyway, this guy, Greg Wadzier, who's the sponsor of the Port Adelaide Football Club and his company, Shanghai Cred, he meant it. And so he kind of, he bankrolled it, he invested into it, and announced it in 2016 when our Prime Minister happened to be in Shanghai. And then the game began. And so 2017 was the first game. And so we've played 3 games there. We weren't able to play this year because of COVID-19. But you've got this very domestic sporting code being the first code to play a game for premiership points. So it wasn't like an NBA end of season or a preseason game. This was for premiership points, which doesn't mean much, to be honest, to the local Chinese fans, but it means a lot to the Australians back here. So yeah, it was a really interesting opportunity. And so for me, coming on board in 2018, it was really driving out that strategy that had been approved by the Commission and the AFL executive to really kind of use the game that had been created to really kind of grow our commercial interests as well as our audience growth into China, and being mindful that we'd kind of missed that first wave of sports, whether it was, the NBA that had done it in the 90s, a lot of the EPL clubs as well who had played and had been touring for years. And it was interesting to kind of watch NHL and the ice hockey ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics in terms of what they were doing. And we're mindful that we're a super niche sport. So, yeah, it was kind of interesting. Day to day, my job sort of pre-COVID was really about shoring up, our pipeline and looking for avenues within which to kind of be that bridge between Australia and China for Australian brands going into China as well as Chinese brands coming into Australia.
The game is pretty unique, and let's just say that the Chinese market is pretty unique.
Yeah.
How did you fit the AFL into China? Were there any unique aspects to the market that you were going into or the game that you were taking there that played well together? What were the challenges that you faced due to any unique aspects of the game or the market that you were going into? And what does the future look like for the AFL in China?
I think, to be really honest, we're really learning. As Deng Xiaoping maybe said, you cross the river by feeling the stones. And so I think in some respects, a lot of our work to date has been really logistical. So it's been about putting on an event, putting on a game, and the unique challenges that happen with local public security, concerns about that many people in one place, alcohol being served, all those sorts of things, as well as player safety and getting the ground up to spec for a professional league. So all of those are unique challenges. But I think uniquely, we were kind of really starting to kind of build out that runway in terms of what that looked like. And so it was, we're really close with, people who had worked at NBA and, Kevin, who's at UFC now, Richard from NFL. So we were kind of, learning our approach, and we, to be really honest, we're like a big fish in a very small pond here. But in China, we weren't even a tadpole. We were, Shanghai's big, but you've lived in Shanghai, Todd. Even when the Grand Prix on in town, you wouldn't know it. Sometimes, unless you sort of. In Melbourne, when we have a sporting event, it takes over the city. Even if it's a touring, EPL team, we had a lot of work to do. We still needed to do a lot of Chinese language media. Our WeChat account was poor. Our social media presence was non-existent. We were building out, and it just started our Chinese office really, and our staff at the sort of tail end of last year. So the future for us is uncertain. We've just gone through a reset. We're playing our our final series starting this week. And I'm not sure if you guys have kind of followed it at all, but like a lot of sports, we suspended our season, which normally runs from March till the end of September. We suspended after our first round and then went on a kind of a break for 6 weeks. Came back in June and have had to kind of have hubs and, a credit to my colleagues that sort of work in footy operations and others to kind of ensure that the season went ahead. Our game is really taxing. It's not like Major League Baseball or NBA where you can play, 3 games in a week. Normally they kind of complain if they have a 6-day turnaround or a 5-day turnaround, but we were getting them to play 3 or 4 day breaks. We had a festival of footy, which was like every night there was a game on for football to try and get through the allocated games that we needed to get through for our broadcast deal, as well as to ensure that we got it. So for this year, we've kind of just been, riding the ship and getting ready for what next season looks like. And obviously that involves China, which is really good. And there's a strong commitment from the AFL towards China. But what that looks like, we're still working through that. And yeah, happy to share once we get that sort of articulated and up through the commission. But at this stage, it kind of feels like we were just starting to kind of walk. And so, if we have to take a pause, we'll take a pause, whatever that is. But yeah, we're not sure what it is at this stage.
Let's look at sports in China from a broader perspective. What sort of sports have Chinese audiences historically responded well to? And how has that changed over, say, the last 10 years?
I think it's interesting. I think sport has been kind of used a bit as a metaphor for different purposes. And so I think, the kind of the New Republic era of Sun Yat-sen and others were kind of drawn into that, almost that sort of German Western European value of kind of exercise and morality. And so there was a real push to kind of do formalized exercise, which did include sport. And that then led obviously to the national games, which were being played. I mean, famously, Chairman Mao, I wouldn't say he swam. I think he kind of floated down the Yangtze River, in the mid 60s, which kind of signaled to everybody that he was still healthy and he was able to kind of, be up for what was really going to be the start of the Cultural Revolution. And then I think if you think about table tennis and ping pong, that was kind of used as part of the normalization relationships of between a US and China. So sports always had a really interesting kind of place in China. And I think the difference to most of your listeners and those that are coming from China is that sport, particularly from an Australian context, is a bottom-up grassroots kind of approach, which means that it's built off kind of community sport. So you as a family might play football, you might play cricket, you might play tennis. You join a club. If you're good, there are pathways and you go through that. And then there's a supportive base that's often built through volunteerism, and a passion that kind of, couples might kind of fight when they have a newborn to see which team they support. And there's that sort of aspect to it. And I think for a country like Australia, sport kind of gives us those myths and heroes that we don't have through our history, if that makes sense. So it's an interesting one, whereas I think in China it's very top down. It's dictated by the state, and there's a real centralization of sports. And so I think traditionally the sports that were popular were those that China was good at. So, I think they're kind of coming out was 84 in the Olympics without the Russians there at the LA Games, Li Ning winning and where that went from there. And then on top of that, I think you had volleyball obviously has been huge for ages, gymnastics, and then diving as well, where they've been really, really super good, and then table tennis. And I think what you saw from kind of organized or professional sports, a lot of those were Olympic or sports, which, interestingly are actually very individual in their kind of orientation and how they work. I think it was really, basketball was that. I mean, I was on campus in the mid 90s and I remember sort of shooting hoops with some fellow international students, and this Chinese guy out of his dormitory shouted out, NBA, I love this game, which was the catchphrase at the time. And, it was the Yao Ming factor and all of those things, plus, I guess, just the huge marketing budgets, the persuasiveness of kind of generations of superstars from Michael Jordan to Kobe Bryant to LeBron now that have really kind of captivated and also been endorsed by those brands like Nike and others in terms of what they've done in market as well. But I think also what you're starting to see now is football or soccer really starting to kind of kick off. And I don't know about you, Todd, but I used to go to some games back in the day, and like Dalian was a power force, the Sichuan team as well from Chengdu. And like, they used to have like police guards because they wouldn't kind of trust the sports fans, but now with Guangzhou Evergrande winning the Asian Champions League, I think in 2016 maybe, and being sort of sponsored by Alibaba or Jack Ma as well as Hengda, a huge, property development company. You're starting to get people that kind of take, they get tattoos of the players. There's kind of what we call Northern Terrace cheer squads that, do chants and stuff. And you're starting to really build a culture of fandom that you don't see. And I know, Andrew from the Mailman Group, and he's seen that all unfold in China. And I think that in some respects, the diet of a Chinese sports fan is predominantly global, and it's less about the local, even though Guoan fans, Beijing fans. Actually, I'll tell you a really interesting story super quick. One of the Champions League games was being played between Evergrande and Melbourne Victory. And the local consul, as they're likely to do, is to try and bolster kind of patriotic spirit in the local Chinese community, gave out sort of Evergrande T-shirts, which I think they said, like, I do it for the motherland or something. A friend of mine, Ming Liu, he's a Beijing Guoan fan. And I said, Ming, what are you doing? Why are you wearing that damn shirt? And he says, oh, it's free. But it's kind of like, it's like for me, and I'm sure maybe for you, Todd, if you barrack for a particular team, you're not wearing another team's T-shirt or jumper if someone gives it to you. And so I think within that, I mean, that's obviously there's a lot to unpack there, but it's also partly around, I guess, that sense of unity and that sense of understanding from a perspective of being Chinese first. So, I think it's interesting. I think sports have really developed. I think it's a huge industry. I think probably the biggest market for a lot of global sports brands and sports industries would be really aware that I think in the 13th five-year plan, the central government made a really strong pitch around sports development and the focus on the sports economy, and really highlighted basketball, soccer and volleyball as the three big balls, as the report was called, to really focus on driving out that opportunity. And I reckon you're going to see, there was a really interesting report saying Xi Jinping has this dream, he has lots of China dreams, but one of them was to, host or win a World Cup by 2050. And, the staggering numbers of opportunities in terms of numbers of pitches that were going to be built, the number of coaches that were going to be trained. And, numbers are important in China, but it'd be really interesting to sort of see 5 years on from the start of that plan, really where it came from. Another good example was Alibaba supposedly gave $100 million to the International Rugby IRB to kind of grow sevens. Rugby in China. Now, that was even 7 years ago. I don't know if any money's changed hand, and I'd be really surprised to see the development of rugby and rugby sevens, notwithstanding that the women's, I think, either won gold or came silver in the Rio Games. But, we just haven't sort of seen that sort of development. So I think the biggest kind of difference is the way people support and as well as the structures of sport in China.
Has your work with Red Tape primarily been targeted at getting Chinese consumers to travel to Australia for sports? Does it involve bringing Australian events like tennis matches or Grand Prix to China, or something else altogether? And just curiously, at the end of that. Talk to us a little bit about, I know that, North American fans of any sport or athlete will travel lots and lots of miles to go watch their team or their player play. Are the Chinese similar in that respect?
Yeah, so Red Tape was interesting. So as a China advisory business, we really kind of did a couple of things. One was around cultural intelligence. So I did a lot of training in corporate Australia and government around, understanding how to kind of engage with China and some of the cultural nuances and the differences, and whether or not you wanted to use that, but just helping you understand, the approach to that. I also took a lot of trade missions to China. So that was like predominantly businesses that were looking, and it was kind of in the food and wine space mainly. And then sports kind of developed out of that, the one that I talked earlier about with the exhibition game, and playing a game in China was kind of a moment for me. And then probably towards the end, it started to be looking at the inbound as more Chinese got passports, more people were traveling. It was also looking at the Chinese community in Australia and how important that was, either as an act as a bridge for, what we now call the Daigou market, which is the kind of personal shoppers that buy stuff through WeChat and send it back to China. And then we have a huge, student community as well, or we did. And so it was really about helping those events, whether it was kind of like the Royal Melbourne Show, which is like the, kind of county or state fairs in the States, through to the Grand Prix and the Australian Open, in terms of sharpening up their tourism and their offering for inbound Chinese tourists or the local Chinese market. So that was when I worked more in the digital space. So we were doing a lot of WeChat mini programs, helping people develop that. So it was a really interesting time over that sort of 7 or 8 years with Red Tape, and then moving into Bastion for 3. And then I think on the question around the sports fan in China and their propensity to travel and geography, I think there's a sense and a connection, and it's interesting too, like, because if you say to your Chinese friends, "Where's your Laojia?" which is like your hometown. It can be complicated because it might be where your father was born or your mother was born, where you were born or where you were raised, where you went to school. So that identity is kind of now, obviously, with the sort of dropping of the hukou and the ability to travel, I think that's changed a bit. But the only thing I would say, again, similarly to kind of some of the questions I answered previously around, I guess, the change in sports that I've seen, is that, Usain Bolt went to this was the guy who was leading into the Beijing Olympics, gold medalist, incredible athlete. And there was a light rain, and I think it was at the Shanghai Stadium, and that could hold 45,000. I reckon they were probably expecting maybe 30-odd thousand, but in the end they got 4,000. And so that now Usain Bolt's a personality. He's an extreme athlete. So I think sports fans in China I think there are some very parochial and very rusted on local fans, and they will, for the soccer clubs, and they will go and follow their team when they go and play. But I think realistically, sport as a pursuit is probably a middle class pursuit when you've got your kids sorted, when you've got your house or your apartment, when you've got job security. Then you can kind of think about how I spend my idle time, if that makes sense. And I think, interestingly enough, for a lot of Chinese people with sports, that's coming at the time too when, there's gaming, there's smartphones, there's apps, there's so many kind of attention, distractors really. Whereas, back in the day, it was kind of sports was your outlet. So I think they're coming to it at a really different time in terms of a lot of different ways that China has as well, but on other industries. But yeah, I think sports is starting to be followed. But at the same time too, I think there are people that feel passionately about Manchester United or Arsenal and will go and eat in an Arsenal-themed restaurant in Shanghai and watch all the games, at weird times in the night because of the difference when the teams were playing in Europe. But and similarly with NBA teams, or athletes, they'll go and pay money to watch LeBron sink some baskets and talk trash for an hour, and so, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I just don't think, similar to what I said about the structures of sport, I think that's why there isn't that sense of engagement, and also probably because talented athletes get identified early, they get put into systems, whether it's sports schools and then sports universities. And if you don't make the national team or the provincial team, you end up being a coach. And if you don't make being a coach, you become an official. But at the same time, too, you look at what's been going on with the CBA recently, and the shifts and changes with local staff there. It's interesting. A lot of the domestic leagues have been, I think are being really much better run than they used to be. There's a lot of concerns about the soccer leagues there around, and that's been cleaned up, much, much better. But yeah, there's that whole sense of officialdom and the running of sports is interesting.
How would you perceive the reaction to some of the more aggressive, assertive, or even perceived as violent parts of certain sports with regards to fighting in the NHL or the aggressiveness of the NFL or even boxing or the UFC?
I mean, UFC is really interesting. I think they've kind of tapped a really interesting market there, and obviously with their female fighter being a world champ, helps as well. And the AFL and Australian football famously used to have king hits and big bumps, and it still is aggressive. We have tackling. And even for a lot of non-Chinese fans, they go, whoa, that's really rough, or in Chinese, lihai, which is kind of formidable. But, a lot of Chinese people, when they first see it, they go, this game's not for me. It doesn't feel like it's for me. And there's a lot of kind of deep questions you can ask around that aspect of and definition of masculinity in China and how it plays out through to that perception of not being visible. And I think that's why Yao Ming and the NBA was so important, because it kind of showed that even though Yao Ming was, literally a freak of nature and so amazing, but, there was a Chinese face. It's that adage of, you can be what you can see. And so I think for us at the AFL, our biggest challenge is having more Chinese Australians or, we have a strong indigenous Australian population that plays. We've had increasingly African migrants playing the game, but as well as from the Middle East and elsewhere, but just a real underrepresentation of Chinese Australians. But that ability to see that. So I think I think there's that perception that violence is not what it means to be Chinese, and it feels foreign. But I think there's a way within which is how you shape it and how you frame it. And so for us, we always talked about the AFL as being, I guess, kind of the healthy outdoor aspirational lifestyle of kind of Brand Australia. So, Brand Australia up until recently had a really great name in China. It was sort of seen as being, young, youthful, sunny, environmentally clean, healthy, fit. And so AFL was an extension of that, both for our male and female athletes. And so that's sort of how we positioned it. It's not that we played down the aggression, but it was sort of more providing it as an opportunity to kind of show how amazing these athletes are and tapping into that kind of wellness trend that's really happening in China. So again, that's sort of some of the ideas we had, but we were just sort of formulating how we'd roll that out.
Okay, well, piggybacking off that a little bit, let's talk how to market a sport to Chinese audiences. Talk a little bit about how that might differ to marketing locally or in Europe or North America. Is it vastly different than marketing other B2C products, services, organizations, you name it? How do you work with that? How would you juxtapose that?
Well, I think for us, our challenge is we're uniquely Australian, but then that gives us that pitch, if that makes sense. So we're not a global sport. We're not played in any other country other than Australia, with the exception of the games we've been playing recently in China. So it's more about how do you kind of share that, and it's kind of knowing the rapid changes that China's, I guess, undergone, and so the dramatic increase in kind of digital literacy. The savviness of e-commerce as their consumers that they have, which far outweighs the kind of smarts and the applications that we have here in Australia, even in lockdown. So part of it is knowing how to kind of play, and you'll hear seminars, you'll hear podcasts talking about young brands and what they did for for KFC in China and how they kind of localized the content. And I think really there's a need to do that, and there's a need to kind of be aware of, I guess, the trends in China, and those trends are rapid and quick. But it's also about having an ability to kind of frame the game in a way that Chinese audiences can engage and understand that. And for us in Australia and with the AFL and what we've done in China, we're still a long way in developing that. And I think, there have been some great sports and some great athletes that have done really well, whether it's been on WeChat, Weibo, or now Douyin or other Bilibili and other types of platforms. But you need to be well resourced. You need to kind of understand what your message is, and then it's about conveying it. So I think there's no unified pathway to China. Doesn't matter if you're a wine from Victoria or a wine from New Zealand. Each one has a different, you have to kind of almost map out a different strategy for each brand. So I think for us, that's something that we're mindful of.
Let's talk a little bit and maybe close this talking about China-Australia relations. Australia has a unique relationship with China, I think we can say. Gone through some changes. There's been some hiccups along the way. Talk to us a little bit about how the relationship between the two countries is going right now and where you're seeing it maybe going in the future, and how that plays a role in how you're able to do business and take a sport like the AFL to China.
Yeah, well, I think, Australia was one of the first countries to kind of recognize China. Our opposition leader in 1971, before Nixon went to China. And then as soon as he was made Prime Minister in 1973, he normalized relations 1 year after the US did. So we've had a really strong relationship, and I think it's really been built off kind of mutual kind of respect around demand and supply, if that kind of makes sense. We had the natural resources, we've got the education systems, tourism destinations, I guess the wine and the food and all those sorts of things that appeal to Chinese consumers. And to be perfectly honest, certainly post GFC, the kind of stimulus package that the Chinese government put forward domestically meant that there was a great demand for our natural resources, which kind of helped us, kind of continue on. And, up until the coronavirus, we'd had 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Now, that wasn't huge, 5%, 10% GDP like China. It was sort of 2%. But, I think most Australians had a really kind of benign view of China, and China, by China, I'm saying the country and the government. I think more recently, whether it's been some issues around the South China Sea and other political things that have happened, and I think the response, and I guess there's been a shift in the Australian government in terms of the way it's approached. I think China has also changed, obviously, under Xi Jinping after 2012. We've seen more recently, probably a more centralizing role for the party in domestic life in China, and that's, I guess, reflected internationally. I think we've also seen, the term limits ending has meant that there's probably been, a different approach from China as much as there has been from Australia, and with that, we put some legislation in which was called anti sort of foreign interference, which is for all countries. But, we also banned Huawei from our 5G network ahead of sort of some of the concerns in the US and the UK more recently. And I think all these sorts of things have really, made China unhappy with our approach. And I think there's a perception that we're sort of in bed with the US, and we always are from a security perspective because of the alliance that we have. But, our Foreign Affairs Minister made it quite clear when Secretary of State Pompeo kind of put some pretty interesting stuff out there about China. And she said, well, with respect to our relationship with China, we have our own relationship and we're pursuing it, through mutual respect. It's certainly at the moment at a low point. And I think there's a whole bunch of geopolitics that are playing out through the US-China relationship, that a country like Australia and perhaps even Canada gets caught up in. And I think that from that, we, as Australia's sort of number one sporting code, and as I sort of said, that aspect of Brand Australia, we're fairly aligned to that kind of relationship. So I think for us, we take dips and curves in along with that, but certainly from our understanding, our relationships with our government officials, our stakeholders, others that are working in China with us, we're still broadcasting our games into China this year. There hasn't been a shift at all in terms of anything that we've noticed, and I think if anything, we've kind of both countries, or let's say both governments, have kind of mapped out really where they stand. And in some respects, that makes it easier to navigate what might be a new normal. But whereas before perhaps there was ambiguity, there's a lot more clarity around that. And it will be challenging, but I think each business will decide how they work through that.
Tom, great chatting with you today. Thanks again so much for coming on the show.
Cheers, man.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands just like yours enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见.